Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is June 12th, 2016, and we're going to talk about a number of different topics tonight. Of course, Syria, the international situation. We're also going to talk about some domestic issues, marijuana, draw your attention to some new activists, and that sort of thing. But we're going to talk about all that tonight. If you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to remind you, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage, ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And the show is rebroadcast all throughout the week here on UCY, and other networks are picking it up as well. A lot of people streaming it. You're more than welcome to stream my show. And for your website, that's fine. In fact, that's encouraged. Everything we can do to get the word out. Now, if you're joining us for the first time and you're interested in my work, then I would remind you that I write for a number of websites, including Activist Post, Natural Blaze, Era of Wisdom, and, of course, my website, BrandonTurbeville.com. And that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all the YouTube videos, all the archive versions of this show. All the relevant information is there, okay? All the books are available there as well, and I encourage you to go check them out. Again, BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the hub and home of all of my work. Now, just a few comments on the elections. Last week we mentioned the elections, and we see that the Wicked Witch of the West, Hillary Clinton, was victorious in California. Well, the Bernie Sanders campaign, feckless as it always is, it still vowed to fight on. But then there was this meeting with Obama. Obama calls a meeting with Bernie, and out of that meeting, Obama reminds Bernie that he should be promoting unity in the Democratic Party, and then Bernie comes out and says, although he'll take it to the convention, he wants to promote unity in the Democratic Party, and then he'll do whatever he can to stop Trump. Well, he should do whatever he can to stop Hillary, and this is why Bernie won't be president. But this is reminiscent of several other Obama meetings where Obama calls in a politician, generally a politician, to inform him of the real agenda of his masters, right? To come in and sit down and remind them to vote for the Affordable Care Act or to promote unity within the party. All of this, the beer with Obama type of method here, where he takes someone in and intimidates them with God knows what, and they come out of a meeting with the president and they have a new opinion on a number of different topics. This is what happened with Bernie. Not surprising. We weren't surprised that Hillary won California. We were, of course, hoping to sabotage that campaign, but that's not going to happen. And Bernie needs to keep fighting, of course. We encourage Bernie to keep fighting. We encourage Bernie to throw a huge fit on the floor of the Democratic Party, have his supporters throw a huge amount of protest in the Democratic Convention. We hope to see chaos. We hope to see disorganization. We hope to see a breakaway of people who are real liberals, more to what Bernie pretends to be, sort of the Dennis Kucinich part of the Democratic Party. Break away. Form a third party or go support the Greens. But whatever we want to see the breakup of the Democratic Party. And the Republicans, the same thing. Let's see a huge fight on at the Republican convention, and let's see those guys break up too. Go support the Libertarians or start a third party. We want to see the complete disintegration of the two-party system. Now, we don't have high expectations of this. Now, I want to be clear. This is what we want to see. We want to see these groups fracture and see the hold of the two-party system broken from holding the country hostage. But we don't have great expectations for that, because what we tend to see is that Hillary Clinton was the nominee before the nomination process even started, and Donald Trump was indeed a wrecker. Donald Trump was intended to wreck much of the Republican Party and to fracture it, which is what he's done, so that Hillary Clinton will be in office. Now, I don't see a situation personally in the United States where Hillary Clinton will not be president, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. Because Bernie is not a fighter. Bernie's not courageous, not in that sense. Bernie is just a total wimp. He doesn't have any guts. He's not going to fight Hillary Clinton on the convention. He'll go to the convention, request the votes, and then he'll endorse Hillary Clinton. There is not going to be a big fight from Bernie. We're hoping that the fight will come from the Bernie supporters, but we know it's not going to come from Bernie Sanders. So she's not going to have to worry about that. Donald Trump, he is on the verge of being screwed over by the Republican Party, either out of the nomination or the Republicans actually run a third-party candidate. And if the Republicans run a third-party candidate, or if Gary Johnson, the private prison industrial complex favorite in Arizona, the Libertarian candidate, starts suddenly getting much more media attention, and we're all for third-party candidates getting more media attention, but we have to be mindful of when that happens, of what the agenda is. If a third-party candidate comes in and steals votes away from Donald Trump, again, that's Hillary in the White House because it's a close race. If the Donald doesn't have to deal with a third-party Republican running in the race, and he continues to say ridiculously stupid things. Now, this is not things that necessarily just galvanize Republicans. You can get away with stupidity when you're trying to galvanize Republicans. But saying things that are so outlandish and so offensive to mainstream America that he loses his appeal. And again, you see Hillary Clinton. Basically, the argument I'm making here is that Donald Trump is nothing but a stalking horse for Hillary Clinton. He's a wrecker designed to wreck a system that was, in terms of popularity, stacked against Hillary Clinton because she's not that popular. Republicans hate her. Mainstream Americans hate her. Real liberals hate her. Only a very small portion of the Democratic Party, who's obsessed with having a woman president, no matter how corrupt, the extreme feminist wing, I guess, is interested in this woman, this Skeksis. So she has to have help, and by making the Republican candidate so odious that choosing him is a non-starter, then she ensures that she will be elected. I don't think Hillary Clinton's the head of the conspiracy, but she's certainly a willing participant, a psychopath, and Donald Trump is a psychopath also. So we have that in order. So we're hoping that Bernie fights. We're not expecting him to. So there's a new hashtag going around, hashtag Jill Not Hill, and that's Jill Stein. So if you're a real liberal out there and you have got to vote, then you should take a look at Jill Stein. If you're a real conservative out there and you've got to vote, then go take a look at Gary Johnson, of whom we are not a fan, but still, if you're a conservative, look at the Libertarian Party if you've just got to vote. Now, my recommendation here is, now we've got Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. It might be time to stay home, ladies and gentlemen, unless there is an issue on your ballot, which is a local issue, a referendum, there's a candidate that you actually support and want to go vote for. I would recommend staying home and not voting for the lesser of two evils in this election. But if you got to go out and vote for something, and I think if there's a good candidate running, I think if there's a referendum that you want to make your voice heard in, that you should go out and cast your vote. We're not anarchists here, but if there are no referendums and there are no good candidates, then stay home and don't participate at all. But if you go vote for the third party. Don't vote for the Democrats or Republicans. Go push a number for the Greens or for the Libertarians and help a third party out, perhaps. something to think about. Now, the other election, James Hinton, County Board of Supervisors, District 2, unfortunately did not work out. He did not advance to the second round of the California primaries. And again, that was not wholly unexpected. The guy was outgunned by hundreds of thousands of dollars for a County Board of Supervisors seat because money was coming from people apparently like Mike Thompson and some other corporations and such to keep the status quo in place. So it's kind of hard with somebody who has limited on-the-ground infrastructure and limited funds. It's so divided in terms of the distance between the amount of money that one candidate had and the other. When it gets to that point, it's almost impossible for someone to really to get out there and be successful in the campaign. Although he did his best, he tried, he's worked hard for the last year, and so we congratulate James on his fight, and we encourage him to not give up the fight. And we thank him for putting his name and his time and his effort out there in order to give the people of District 2 a choice. And if there's any listeners out there as well who'd ever thought about running for office, then now's your time. You only have a short window, and I encourage you to do that. If you would like to run for office and you need a platform, then go to my website and look up the platform, right? A Real New Deal for America. That's what you can type in on my website, or if you can't find that, you can always email me, anticodex@yahoo.com, and I will mail you that article. I will send you a list of platform points, and this is at the federal level, but this could be done at the state as well. So I encourage you to do that. Get your name on the ballot. It's a process then of campaigning and trying to take in funds. Sometimes you have to put yourself into the sand and the sweat and the blood of the arena in order to make a difference. You're not always successful, but it sometimes is the fight that actually makes the difference. And so we encourage all the listeners to look at that as an option. If you're a good speaker, if you're an extrovert, then go out and start campaigning and start trying to get power in one of these offices. That's the goal of a revolution, after all, is to gain power. It's not to simply educate other people. It's to gain power, and that's what we want to encourage people on our side to do. Now, I've gotten a number of interesting emails from the listeners here, things that are going on across the state, things that are going on across the country, and even outside the country. We're working on making connections outside of the United States as well on that front. And we're seeing individuals. I'm not at liberty to discuss just yet what they're doing, but I will be doing that soon, right? There's a couple that I can mention. Some are burning up DVDs and handing them out. Some are handing out flyers. I think that's great. And then we've got other people looking at doing other more outside of the box types of activism. So we encourage all of you to do that. I want to thank the listeners who've written me, who've emailed me and told me what they're working on. And I want you to keep doing that. Keep me up to date on what you're doing, and then hopefully we'll eventually be able to connect you guys and unify have some type of unified front for this activism. Now, there's a couple of things I want to talk about before we get into the Syrian situation. Now, the question of the minimum wage is something that's come up in the debates repeatedly. And the one side of the debate, of course, doesn't want to raise the minimum wage. The other side, in fact, even wants to lower it in some more reactionary factions. And then on the other side of the issue, we have people like Bernie Sanders calling for, I do believe, a $15 minimum wage. Hillary Clinton calls for nothing except when she's pressed, and then she supports no raising the minimum wage. She supports raising the minimum wage. She supports $12 an hour. She supports Well, whatever your position is, Hillary Clinton supports it, according to Hillary Clinton. So it's kind of hard to nail her down on that. But she doesn't support the $15 minimum wage, actually. That's something that her and the Byrne have debated on a number of instances, and Bernie tepidly criticized her for that. But she does not support the $15 minimum wage. But nevertheless, we get a number of responses coming back from individuals who are, I don't know what other term to use it, but essentially brainwashed into this idea that the minimum wage is a bad thing. I get comments from particularly some of our libertarian friends, and of course the Republicans, definitely the Republicans, that, and I would say even more so the Republicans, that the living wage is not intended, the minimum wage is not intended to be the living wage. Now, the Republicans generally don't argue for lowering it or getting rid of it, but they always argue for not raising it. The Libertarians will actually argue for eliminating the minimum wage, which is even worse. We won't get into the details of that debate, but I want to point out some issues with that, right? Ever since this program, the minimum wage, was enacted in 1938, there have been powerful industry and banking interests that lobbied against it, and logically against the prospect of ever raising it. And the reasons behind such large corporations and banks' opposition to the federal minimum wage statutes and the subsequent increase in wage payments is simple enough to understand. They don't want to do it. But much of the public, much of their public crowing over the issue has hidden the greed behind their argument, and they've produced their argument in carefully crafted propaganda, and that's unfortunately been eaten up by many people in the general public who are, they are the ones suffering under wage stagnation and the prospect of poverty, but propaganda is unfortunately successful with them. Now, fear of losing your job, fear of automation, and fear of reduced profits have all been trotted out as a defense against the raising of the minimum wage, and some more extreme elements, as I pointed out, even against the concept of the minimum wage itself. One of the more common rebuttals that you might be accustomed to hearing from opponents in regards to the minimum wage is that the minimum wage was never meant to be a living wage, and that it was originally meant to simply be an entry-level wage. This is something that I hear on a number of occasions, that minimum wage was never supposed to be something you could raise a family on. That was only supposed to be an entry-level wage. In other words, according to these guys, the minimum wage was merely set to establish an entry-level wage so that a worker could gain some experience in a trade, but it was never meant to provide that worker with a livable wage by which he could support himself or his family. And that's the response that I hear repeated by a lot of free market proponents and often generally well-meaning people who've been just incredibly misled by Wall Street and corporate interest. The argument, it's obviously promoted by Wall Street and free market fetishists, simply doesn't have any basis in reality. Whatever you might think about the minimum wage, there's very little doubt that the minimum wage was indeed meant to be a living wage. You only need to look at the statements of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the father of the American minimum wage, to see that this is the case. And let's take a look at some of Roosevelt's quotes. This is 1933, his statement on National Industrial Recovery Act. In my inaugural, I laid down the simple proposition that nobody is going to starve in this country. It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. By business, I mean the whole of commerce as well as the whole of industry. By workers, I mean all workers, the white-collar class as well as the men in overalls. And by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. Throughout history, the change from starvation wages and starvation employment to living wages and sustained employment can in large part be made by an industrial covenant to which all employers shall subscribe. It is greatly to their interest to do this because decent living, widely spread among our 125 million people, eventually means the opening up to industry of the richest market which the world has known. Now, 1938, the fireside chat, the night before signing the Fair Labor Standards Act that instituted the federal minimum wage. He says, do not let any calamity-howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day who has been turning his employees over to the government relief rolls in order to preserve his company's distributed reserves tell you, using his stockholders' money to pay the postage for his personal opinions, tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry. And then we also have another quote. Without question, the minimum wage starts us toward a better standard of living and increases purchasing power to buy the products of farm and factory. So, let's go to another. June 16th, 1933, the presidential statement on the NIRA. On this idea, the part of the first act proposes to our industry a great spontaneous cooperation to put millions of men back in their regular jobs this summer. The idea is simply for employers to hire more men to do the existing work by reducing the work hours of each man's week and at the same time paying a living wage for the shorter week. Now, we're not going to comment on the crimes of Roosevelt, right? We know he is not a good guy. We know about the concentration camps, and we know about the Pearl Harbor intrigue, and we know about the growing control on the lives of average individual citizens and the crackdown on civil liberties under Roosevelt. But on this issue, we have to say that the minimum wage was clearly a beneficial statute, and it helped lift the United States out of a culture of gross overwork, of low pay, and general impoverishment, and that all that had existed before the establishment of the federal minimum wage. There were other things besides the minimum wage that went into effect. But it was certainly a step in the right direction in the midst of many other missteps by the U.S. government. But the minimum wage was largely brought about because of the tireless fight by the labor movement and workers who had suffered under the corporate, industrial, and banking oppression that were, and these workers were not content to continue doing so. So whatever you think of the minimum wage, you think it should be raised, you think it should be kept the same or lowered or eliminated, stop arguing that it was not meant to be a living wage, because it was. You're only making yourself look foolish. You're going to have to argue on some type of ideological grounds, and I think anybody with a job is going to look at you arguing to lower or eliminate the minimum wage and rightfully scoff and ignore what you have to say, because it's quite frankly ridiculous, and it's destroying the living standards of the country by keeping people in low wages and impoverished states. So there's that. Now, I also want to talk about the marijuana issue here too. There's a new study confirming what millions of marijuana smokers have already known, right? The worst side effect from marijuana is getting arrested. And, well, that and periodontal disease, apparently. According to researchers at Duke University and senior author of the study, Terry Moffat, the only measures that seemed to indicate any real serious health problem with marijuana was periodontal disease. And that's not even an effect of the plant. The author, Moffat, says anything you smoke heats up your gums, it causes inflammation, and inflammation is bad for your teeth. So it's effect of heat, not an effect of marijuana. Now, the researchers were unable to find a link between adult use of marijuana and poor lung function. They could not find a link between weed and systemic inflammation, body mass index, blood pressure, and metabolic health. All that there was no correlation between marijuana and poor function of any of those things. So the study's shown that people who smoked marijuana for up to 20 years were as healthy as people who didn't smoke marijuana at all. And the same research team found out in a previous study, this is interesting, that marijuana users were at higher risk of cognitive decline and descent into lower social and economic strata. But the side effects really end there, and it doesn't seem to be physical health issues. The side effects are economic and social, but not physical. Now, anybody who smokes marijuana knows from observance that cognitive decline can occur in chronic users. This is where I think people are somewhat dishonest. Now, I don't think that people smoke weed and then they damage their brain permanently and they can never get that back. But I do think that it's being somewhat dishonest, even on the pro-marijuana side, to say that some people, that no one smokes marijuana and becomes lethargic and can have cognitive decline. That's not true, and anybody who's been out in the world can see that that is the case with some individuals. That is the case with some, not all and not most, but it's the case with some. The question of lower social and economic status needs to be addressed, though, because this may result not from the plant and not from the cognitive decline, but from decades of a police state and a drug war that confines, even the most peaceful, unoffensive marijuana users to be put in cages, and then a life of second-class citizenship, particularly when it comes to employment. So it might not be that the plant has anything to do with it. The damn drug war has something to do with it, right? No wonder you will be lower economic status when you can't get a job because some crew-cut thug threw you in a cage and some guy wearing a black dress put you in a cage for a longer period of time, and now you can't get a job because of your criminal record. It's not really hard to figure out what that correlation is. So it's really clear that the drug war is infinitely more dangerous to both marijuana users and non-users than the plant could ever be. But we'll move on to another issue. Now, I want to draw your attention to an artist by the name of Jill Love. That's the name that she goes by, right? She's an international artist. She's from Spain. I think she's in California now. She's done sort of a unique brand of activism, which is called Artivism. Now, she didn't invent that concept, but she seems to be reinventing it in a number of different ways. A lot of people don't know what that term is. Art, it's simple, right? Art plus activism, Artivism. But most artists who do this tend to use graffiti, stencils, street art, spoken word, all that kind of stuff, more traditional forms of art with a little twist. But Jill Love is combining aesthetics and protest. She's adding an element of performance that brings the art to the audience rather than bringing the audience brings the audience to the art, right? So it's not something that you go to the art gallery to see. She's bringing that out to people on the street, and she's tackling issues that are important, right? The genocide of Palestinians, animal rights, bullfighting, vaccines, chemtrails, all of it is thought-provoking, and it's often controversial. She's trying to create a social movement, and she calls that project the Jill Love Revolution, and it's garnered attention worldwide. She's caught the attention of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Nation of Change, True Activist. So she's brought her method of artistic passive resistance to thousands of people across the world. She's been outspoken against animal cruelty and for animal rights in general. She's, again, I said, a native of Spain. She's used the art to speak out against bullfighting, this practice of enraging and torturing and then killing a bull for the entertainment of spectators is quite savage, and she's protested it. You can go to my article, Artivist Jill Love Tackles Chemtrails, Vaccines, and Animal Rights, and you can see pictures of what she's done. She's protested bullfighting on a number of occasions. One of the most effective and visual, I think, was when she went to Madrid and laid down on the street in Madrid, completely nude, covered in fake blood, and she had a sign next to her that said, "Murdered by bullfighters in Spain. Do you think this image is outrageous? Spain is different." And she also has a quote from Gandhi, where she says, "The greatest of a nation will be judged by the way its animals are treated." Well, another low mark for the United States, I suppose. Now, she's also had this brilliant artistic critique of Coca-Cola, where she's photographed drinking a soda and vomiting up blood to showcase the contents, the toxic contents of the drink, and the call for a boycott of the corporation. Not only for its detrimental effects on human health, but she points out that it's funding wars and the Palestinian genocide, and that it creates violence, illness, and addiction. She's also spoken out against vaccines and chemtrails, and there's some pictures of that. And she's standing on the street, partially nude, with a couple of other people, with "chemtrails are real" written across her body, and that's garnering some attention there in California. So go look at my article. Artivist Jill Love tackles chemtrails, vaccines, and animal rights at naturalblaze.com, and I think you can take a look at the pictures in that article. Now on to the international Syrian situation. All right, let's take a look at this. I want to mention a brief report. The French, we have another confirmation that's coming out regarding what we already knew since the beginning of the crisis, but up until this point, authorities have tried to deny. But that's that French special forces are indeed active on the ground in Syria. So, according to reports by a French news agency, AFP, the special forces, the French special forces, are working alongside terrorists in northern Syria in an effort to guide the operation to take Manbij. So they're working alongside the SDF. That's a loose coalition of terrorists, of YPG, of Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, and others, but they're supported by the United States and NATO. We had a French Defense Ministry official telling AFP, quote, "The offensive at Manbij is clearly being backed by a certain number of states, including France. It's the usual support. It's advisory," end quote. So up until this point, France has only publicly acknowledged the presence of about 150 Special Forces fighters operating in Iraq's Kurdistan region. And we have Jean-Yves Le Drian, French defense minister. He told a French television channel on Friday that France was not only providing air support and arms to the so-called rebels, but that they were offering tactical advice. But he didn't mention the deployment of the special forces. We have French Army spokesman Colonel Gilles Geron stating, "We never go into details about anything to do with special forces, which are by their nature special. You won't get any details to protect these men's activities." Okay, now this is not the first time that we've had the French in Syria that we know about, right? We've known about French military soldiers since, I think, 2011. It was reported early on in the Syrian destabilization that 13 French military officers who were acting as mercenaries and death squad participants were captured by the Syrian government, all while the mainstream media reported the events as peaceful protest and grassroots organic Syrian uprising against an oppressive regime. So around the same time, we had hacked emails obtained by Anonymous in December 2011, and they were released by WikiLeaks in steady drips since February 27th, 2012, which revealed that NATO troops, including those from the U.S., the U.K., and France, were likely already operating inside Syria. And these emails were obtained from the private U.S. intelligence firm Stratfor, and they were apparently sent by Stratfor's Director of Analysis, Reva Bala, and they contained discussion of a December confidential Pentagon meeting, which was attended by quote, senior analysts from the U.S. Air Force and representatives from its chief allies, France and the United Kingdom. Tellingly, the email's author stated that the U.S. officials said without saying that Special Operation Forces teams, presumably from the U.S., UK, France, Jordan, and Turkey, are already on the ground, and that they are focusing on reconnaissance missions and training opposition forces. It said later in that email, just to remind everyone, that the idea hypothetically would be to commit guerrilla attacks, assassination campaigns, and try to break the back of the Alawite forces and elicit collapse from within. Well, what happened, right? What has taken place over the last few years? That shouldn't come as any surprise, of course, since Western troops and intelligence agents have maintained a heavy presence inside Libya during the destruction of that nation and increasing their presence. The destruction and subsequent invasion succeeded. So that's something that we already knew, but now we have confirmation through the mainstream media. Now, we should mention, too, the Assad statement. Assad recently stated to the Syrian parliament, he delivered one of his most powerful speeches to date, right? He tackled the issue of elections, of democracy, of Turkish ambitions, the battle against Western-backed jihadist invasions. His words have garnered attention from Syrians and, of course, from Western governments and their propaganda outlets, more commonly called news organizations here in the United States. But it's all negative press, of course, in the West. 5 years on into this Western-backed invasion of jihadists and terrorists, Assad is defiantly standing in the face of the world's greatest military power, and he's refusing to back down to imperialist demands and the Anglo-American agenda for Syria. In the speech, Assad he touted Syrian democracy, and he pointed out that there was an unprecedented number of voters that turned out to vote this past election, despite the widespread warfare and the dangers of participation because of the targeting of voters and polling stations by Western-backed terrorists. He addressed the Syrian military's push toward Raqqa, which we're going to discuss in a second. He said, just like we liberated Palmyra and many other areas before it, we are going to liberate each and every inch of Syria from their hands because we have no other choice but to win. The Syrian, Assad also paid tribute to a number of Syrian soldiers who fought bravely and those who have lost their lives in the battle against the West's terrorists. And he gave praise to Syria's allies, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, China, etc. But he also had harsh words for Erdogan, right? He said for Erdogan, who he called a fascist regime, and that's true. He says, Aleppo will be the grave where all the dreams and hopes of that butcher will be buried. Well, let's hope so. This is Assad reasserting himself, right? This is now a more confident Assad who sees a light at the end of the tunnel for Syria, and hopefully the Syrian people are able to see that light at the end of the tunnel as well, because the terrorists are losing, and there's the push now for Raqqa that we'll be discussing. But he also addressed the failure of the Geneva peace talks and the recent failure of the ceasefire agreement, which ended after Mohammed Alouche, who was the negotiator for the HNC, lead negotiator of the so-called opposition, and the leader of Jaish al-Islam, Assad said that at no point were the talks ever genuine on part of the so-called opposition. After these groups failed to get what they wanted in Geneva, they simply packed up their toys and went home. And that's when they saw the targeting of civilians in hospitals in Aleppo. And the last thing I want to mention about his speech, he addressed the domestic issue and the question of corruption and nepotism in Syrian governments. And what have we been talking about the last couple of weeks, the last few minutes of the show, where I've tried to reserve some time to talk about the Assad reforms. This is his quote recently. If restoring security to Syria, achieving victory over terrorism, bringing back the homeland and reconstructing it is an outcome that stops the martyrs' blood from being spilt in vain, then fighting the harmful phenomena of corruption, nepotism, and disregard for the law are the second part of that. And that's his quote. So, again, note that the reform process was already taking place in Syria before the 2011 destabilization, albeit in a much slower manner than many Syrians had hoped. But, again, this speech is a defiance of Western aims in Syria. It's a growing confidence that the terrorist days are numbered, and it's going to be contagious, we hope, to all the other onlookers. So now we need to talk about the race for Raqqa, right? We have the Syrian military that's quickly closing in on Raqqa, and it's one of the last full-on ISIS strongholds in the country. And Syrian military is expected to reach the city within a matter of weeks or even days, but I think weeks, perhaps months, is where the battle between the government and terrorists is inevitable. Now, we recently saw that the Syrian military liberated a number of areas in eastern Syria near the Takba air base, which is another site that's expecting liberation in the next few days. The Syrian military has already reached the edge of Raqqa province. Okay, Raqqa has acted as the ISIS capital since ISIS appeared a couple of years ago in the middle of the desert, just virtually untouched. No one saw this happening, even though you could read the Iraqi media and see that it was happening. The United States had no idea, but ever since then, ISIS has pretty much remained untouched in Raqqa, since the Syrian military has been bogged down in a number of major cities in western central areas of the country in the fight against the terrorists there. Now, despite the rhetoric of fighting to degrade and destroy ISIS, the United States coalition has yet to bomb Raqqa. And fresh on the heels of a major public relations victory in Palmyra, Syrian military is now marching toward Raqqa to do the same thing there. And if they're successful, it's going to score one of the biggest victories in the war after 5 years. That's not only because the de facto ISIS capital is going to be eliminated, or even because the Syrian military is going to gain more territory. That's all part of it. But it's also because the liberation of Raqqa is going to be another example of how the Syrian military would have accomplished in weeks what the United States and coalition members have claimed is going to take a decade to do. It's going to be another instance where the lack of will on the part of the United States to actually destroy Daesh is being put on display for the rest of the world, either causing the U.S. to look weak in the eyes of the world or exposing it for actually supporting the terrorist organizations to begin with. Regardless, the victory for the Syrian government will be twofold, unless the United States gets there first, and this is where we're getting into the problem. Right? The U.S. interests in Raqqa. The U.S. has been using the presence of ISIS in Syria as an excuse to bomb, as an excuse to send special forces, to publicly support terrorists, to possibly invade. They've been doing this ever since the Western-backed ISIS force has appeared on the scene 2 years ago. But despite the rhetoric, the United States and the coalition have not bombed Raqqa, and they've largely abstained from bombing any other terrorist group. Instead, they focused on bombing Syrian military targets, on civilians, civilian infrastructure, acting as a deterrent to the Syrian military's movement in rebel-held area of the country, and I guess I should say terrorist-held areas of the country. And the United States now seems to have great interest in Raqqa after not bombing it for 2 years, right? It's aiding this loose collection of terrorists and fanatical Kurds and Arabs, the Syrian democratic forces around Raqqa. So why the sudden interest in Raqqa? It's fairly simple. The United States sees clearly that the Syrian military and its Russian allies are going to liberate Raqqa soon enough, and the U.S. doesn't want to suffer another public relations setback. A defeat for ISIS is then a humiliation for the United States. That fact alone should raise eyebrows. But regardless, the United States wants to have its own victory in Raqqa before the Syrians and Russians can have theirs. And I say victory, I should put that in quotes, right? They want to have their own victory in Raqqa. So if the SDF is able to take Raqqa, and again I put take Raqqa in scare quotes, the U.S. is going to be able to shout from the rooftops that America liberated Raqqa and defeated ISIS in its capital, and they did so using moderate rebels, moderate forces. That's what they're going to be saying in the Western media. The U.S. has another goal in Raqqa, and that's the theft of more Syrian territory by using those proxy forces going by the name of the SDF. So whether or not ISIS proper is in control of Raqqa is merely a secondary concern for the United States. If the SDF succeeds in imposing control over the city and the province, then the West is going to have succeeded in cementing control over the area in the hands of the proxy terrorists once again. So it's still going to be under control of their forces, but with a different name, right? Another incarnation of the same jihadist fanaticism. The U.S. can then go out and use the moderate rebel card to keep Russia and Syria from bombing those fighters, because they've merely assumed a position handed to them, even if it's handed to them as a result of some level of violence by ISIS. Now, here's where we come to the real concerning part. With the situation as it stands, there is now the very real possibility of some type of major confrontation taking place in Raqqa that could very well have an international ramification. On one hand, there's the Syrian military that's backed by the Russian Air Force and Russian Special Forces, and they're heading east to Raqqa. And on the other side, you've got the Syrian Democratic Forces that are backed by the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Special Forces, and they're heading west toward Raqqa. Both sides are in a race to gain control of the ISIS capital. Both sides are in a race to gain that territory. And both sides are anxious to declare a victory for the whole world to look at and see for public relations. But what if they arrive in Raqqa at the same time? What if they get there at the same time? In other words, there's a distinct possibility that in this race for Raqqa, that the Syrian-Russian alliance might find itself face-to-face with the possibility of a direct military conflict with the U.S. SDF terrorist alliance. And at that point, the question is going to be who, if either one, will back down. If both forces decide to push forward, the result could be devastating not only for Syria but for the rest of the world if that confrontation escalates. Regardless of what happens, and I've got to point this out, it's important to remember that the Syrian military is acting entirely in self-defense, both against the terrorists posing as rebels, and in self-defense also against the United States. We have Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. All of them have been invited into Syria. They're all acting legally with the assent of the Syrian government, while the United States and the U.S. coalition, once again, acting completely outside of international law and attempting to shore up these terrorist proxies. I mean, once again, the United States as coalition of the willing is pushing the patience of the rest of the world. So I think that people should be aware, if this confrontation takes place, it's not the fault of Syria, it's not the fault of Russia, it's the fault of the United States. So always remember that. And hopefully we'll be able to continue discussing the situation if this confrontation doesn't get out of hand. Now, let's talk about one other thing here in terms of the Syrian situation. The demonstration of the U.S. support for Al-Qaeda in general, not just Al-Qaeda in Syria, but in general, the United States has now, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, requested that the Russian military refrain from bombing al-Nusra targets. Now, the United States is somewhat denying this, but they're claiming that it simply wants Russia to be more careful when it comes to selecting targets so it doesn't hit moderate rebels. It only hits ISIS or al-Nusra, but not moderate rebels. Russia's argument is that if moderate rebels want to avoid being bombed, they should cease intermingling and working with terrorist forces who are considered extreme and not part of the ceasefire. Lavrov says, they're telling us not to hit Nusra because there is a normal opposition next to it. But that opposition must leave terrorist positions, or we have long agreed on that. All right, so that's Lavrov's quote. This sounds reasonable enough. Of course, it's all predicated on the idea that there's such a thing as a moderate rebel in Syria, which there is not. But that issue's been covered ad nauseum in my articles, in my books, in this show. We're not going to go there right now. But it's been, demonstrated beyond reasonable debate to be a lie of propaganda coming from the West and Western media outlets that there's anything resembling a moderate rebel in Syria. Now, we had U.S. State Department spokesman Mark Toner telling reporters at a press conference in Washington, he says, "This is a common refrain, common theme that we've been conveying to the Russians over the past weeks. We obviously all agree that ISIL and the Nusra Front pose a real threat to the security on the ground in Syria." He also said that airstrikes against the non-existent moderate rebels and non-existent intentional airstrikes on civilians make people, quote, more supportive of these terrorist groups, and that is a dynamic we've seen play out in Syria for years now because of the regime's actions. So, what is this guy? Living in a bizarre parallel universe where people not only support Daesh, but where that support is actually increasing. What planet do you live on, Mr. Toner? He certainly does not live in Syria, where there's only an infinitesimally small portion of Syrians that ever supported the rebels. that ever supported the terrorists, and where that support was, it's now dwindled and even continued to dwindle even amongst the most impressionable of civilians. He certainly isn't living in the same universe as the rest of us, since his claim is that Assad is responsible for the bombing of civilians and some phantom support of ISIS. We've discussed all of that here on this show. That suggests that Assad is bombing civilians. There's no evidence of that. It doesn't work in Assad's favor. Why would he do it? It makes absolutely no sense, and there's no evidence to back up Toner's claim or anything coming from the State Department in that regard. The support of ISIS, that is idiotic, stupid. It's a lie. There is no connection between Assad and ISIS. Now, Toner's not even following his own logic. See, according to his own statement, he says the United States bombing campaign that's been aimed at the Syrian military and civilians and civilian infrastructure, that would be considered a campaign that makes more people supportive of these terrorist groups. Would it not? Right? That's his own logic. So just to be clear, for those who aren't quite able to keep up with all these terrorist group names, and that's okay, because you should assume that if this is an anti-Assad group in Syria, that they're terrorist groups. I will say that the Kurds are slightly different, but not a great organization. So we're not a fan of the YPG here either. But if you're looking at anti-Assad rebel, then you're looking at ISIS, Nusra, Al-Qaeda. It's all the same, right? Look at that as all the same. But for the people who want to keep up with the exact names, it's very difficult. But remember that al-Nusra, which is who we're talking about, who the U.S. State Department requested of the Russians that they stop bombing, that's not merely an Al-Qaeda-linked organization. It is Al-Qaeda. Al-Nusra is nothing more than the Syrian branch of the Al-Qaeda franchise. Even the schizophrenic U.S. doesn't deny that, right? This is when the U.S. requests Russia to refrain from bombing Al-Qaeda. Americans should start looking around and asking why the United States, after a decade of war and terror and the shredding of the Constitution, why the United States would demand that the organization that stands as the basis for those acts, right? We're told that happened on 9/11, that they're asking that they would be spared from destruction. What happened to never forgetting 9/11, right? What happened to the civil liberties that disappeared under the guise that our government was protecting us from Al-Qaeda? Can we have those back now if the war on Al-Qaeda is over? Because it apparently is. The United States is rushing in to protect them. So the answer to these questions is simple. The United States does not want to destroy Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda is the CIA's Arab Legion. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS are nothing more than proxies that are wholly controlled, wholly organized, and wholly directed by Western intelligence, who are using it for geopolitical purposes and proxy wars and for the justification of dismantling any shred of civil liberties back home. If the collusion, and I say collusion at best, between the United States and Al-Qaeda is not abundantly clear to people by now, it's difficult to imagine what else could be able to convince them of what should be painfully obvious for any onlookers. Now, in addition to this question of Raqqa, we should also mention that there are other issues that are showing the potential for some type of major confrontation. And we should mention the Polish drills. We've had some drills involving the United States, the British, and Polish troops, and it's called Anaconda. And they're some of the largest NATO drills of their kind. And they're doing nothing to ease the tensions with Russia over the deployment of the missile system, which is aimed at Russia and being placed essentially at Russia's doorstep. We have U.S., British, and Polish soldiers who were parachuting to the ground in Poland this week as a massive show of force, as NATO launched what Reuters is reporting is the biggest war game in Eastern Europe since the Cold War. The exercise, of course, it's 10 days of maneuvers, involves 31,000 troops. It's intended to shore up security on the alliance's eastern flank, where we'll get into some of that later. Commanding General Ben Hodges of the U.S. Army in Europe told reporters, "There's no reason to be nervous. This is purely defensive." It's purely defensive all the way on the other continent, right up on another country's doorstep. That sounds pretty damn offensive to me. So they're being held about a month ahead of a Nato summit in Warsaw that's going to seal the largest revamp since the Cold War by deploying more troop rotations in Eastern Europe. Members who are concerned about how they're going to deal with the coming war between the United States and Russia. So Russia is opposing the NATO drills. The U.S.-led alliance is calling those drills part of its deterrence and dialogue strategy. The Kremlin responded to these drills, and he said, Dmitry Peskov said, "The exercises do not contribute to an atmosphere of trust and security. Unfortunately, we are still witnessing a deficit in mutual trust." Indeed. So there's troops from 24 states, 14,000 from the U.S., as well as countries like Ukraine and so forth. You can bet that the United States is making up the bulk of that because everyone is always willing to fight and die to the last American. Now, we've also got this question of the Russian base. It's strange logic to consider a military base being built inside of one's own country as an aggressive act. It can be considered an act of strategic positioning, and it really can't be argued that Russia is not being forced to respond to U.S. provocation and encirclement. And it's for this reason that it appears that the Russians are building a new base on the Russian-Ukraine border in an effort to protect themselves from the growing potential of a direct confrontation with NATO troops, which something that seems to be getting closer and closer by the day now. We had a lull at one point where it seemed like tensions were eased. Now we seem to be moving back in the direction of potential warfare. So Russia's building an army base near its border with Ukraine, which is the latest in a chain of new military sites. What's being built around the front line there on the western front, on Russia's western front. So there's been we have a reporter from Reuters who visited Klintsy, which is about 30 miles from Ukraine, where the reporter saw a makeshift army camp, large numbers of newly arrived servicemen and military vehicles. He looked at this, he interviewed people nearby, and everybody seems to know that this is a military base. We had a report from Anton Zevrev, who wrote for Reuters, in a moment of clarity for a mainstream media reporter. He says, "Each side says it is only responding to steps taken by the other, but the build-up risks locking NATO and Russia into a spiral of measure and countermeasure from which it will be difficult to escape." Indeed, I agree, and that is concerning. And the article didn't point out that the American NATO aggression is the reason why Russia feels the need to shore up its defenses, but that is certainly the case. So we're going to talk more about this. There's also the question of the Russian and American aircraft carriers now in the Middle East, the Mediterranean. We'll talk about that later, probably next week. We've got a lot of issues to discuss next week as well. We're going to try to get to them. But tonight we are now out of time, unfortunately, but we're going to pick up a lot of stuff next week. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. We'll see you next week.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening